Hey guys, and welcome to the second video on the Byzantine Empire, where we'll be talking mostly about the economy, agriculture, industry, and trade, and also on some cultural aspects, most notably on Byzantine religion. So starting with the economy, it's important to understand that agriculture was the backbone of the Byzantine economy. The main areas where they would get their agriculture was down here in Egypt, Anatolia, in this area, the lower Danube River, the Danube River that runs through here, down through Eastern Europe and so forth. That was really considered to be the breadbasket of the Byzantine Empire. And because of this large agricultural output, they were able to support a large urban population. You had the Greek cities, you had Constantinople, obviously, and then you had the Egyptian cities as well. So a lot of urban centers in the Byzantine Empire. Let's get rid of this. Now, the theme system, well, I mentioned this in the last slide. This was a system where they divided the empire up into military districts. You see all the different ones that you have here. And it maintained centralization. It gave out small plots of land and basically as a reward for military service. It also kind of locked these peasant families into military service in later generations as well, but it did give them ownership of it. And because of it gave this ownership, it strengthened the class of the free peasants. It also solidified agriculture. It really made agriculture the kind of the base of the taxation. It made it the base of economic output. Even though there was trade, there was a limited industry and so forth, farming and agriculture really was the source of wealth overall throughout the empire. And as I mentioned before, the free peasants, they were the backbone of Byzantine agriculture. They owned small plots of land, and the government, especially in the early days of the empire, they gave them protection, because the more peasants you had that owned individual plots of land, the larger your tax base were. Wealthy families buying up large tracts of land resulted in peasants becoming sharecroppers. You see here where sharecropping is where you don't individually own the land, and you certainly don't own the resources. You need to basically rent everything, or you buy everything, including even the seeds. It was a system that was used in the South basically to keep freed African Americans from ever rising up too high. So they basically were reduced to sharecropping or serfdom, right, where they were tied to the land, and basically the large landowners controlled everything. And as it progressed like this hurt the overall tax base, and it also led to a decrease in military recruits, because as I said, the system of the free peasants under the theme system, as it started to die out, basically it turned it more into feudalism, right, where large landowners had total control over the land and decentralized everything. This would hurt overall not only the economy, but the Byzantine government as well. All right, industry and trade. The big trade for them was silk. They dominated the silk trade by stealing silkworm breeding techniques from China. It was actually smuggled out of China by monks. So they no longer needed to rely on Chinese silks in order to make that the hot commodity in the Eastern Mediterranean. And you see here's Constantinople, and that was at the western end of the Silk Road. But you see all this stuff, whether it was wool rugs, whether it was, the jade, whether it was crystal, metalwork, all this stuff, it would all make its way to the Mediterranean by going through Constantinople. So that brought an awful lot of wealth. Complex banking systems were developed because of this, because of all the money that was coming through. And this all led to the use of the Byzant. The Byzant was the standard currency in the Mediterranean. Think of it similar to the way that the American dollar is accepted all over the world. That was the way that the Byzant was used. You could basically do business almost anywhere in the Mediterranean with the Byzant. Now, Constantinople was the center of everything. It was known as the city, the same way as, people in the New York area, if you're going into New York City, you would just simply say the city and everyone knows what you're referring to. And it was a bustling metropolis. There was tremendous wealth. It had massive palaces. It also retained certain Roman cultural aspects, such as the baths. They used to say Constantinople is a city of baths. So a lot of cultural legacies from Rome could be found in Constantinople. There was the wealthiest city in Europe. This was largely because of trade. And there was also an awful lot of attractions, aside from the theaters and things like that. There was large-scale entertainment similar to as you had in Rome, and this was typified in the Hippodrome. The Hippodrome was a large chariot arena, not quite as big as the Circus Maximus, but still, it was pretty big. And the most popular spectator sport was chariot races. So a lot of people are always piling into the Hippodrome. This did lead to rival fan factions such as the Green and the Blues. In 532, they mounted a massive uprising. It started out as a riot of them fighting amongst themselves, and then they joined forces and decided to take over the city. It ended up destroying huge chunks of it. The army had to be called in, and thousands of people were killed. Justinian eventually rebuilt it, and this, after putting it down violently, and this led to the building of a lot of iconic architecture, such as the Hagia Sophia. Now, education. Education was big for them. It was based on a Greek heritage. Greek became the official language of the empire after the 6th century. And because of this, there was a strong emphasis on the Greek philosophers, right? Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, and so forth. There was a strong emphasis on education. They needed educated people for the large bureaucracy that ran the Byzantine government. State-sponsored schools provided primary education. Now, not everybody could go on to the higher forms of education, like you see here, the University of Constantinople. But still, there was widespread literacy. Basic literacy was very, very common, even amongst some of the lower classes. Not the bottom of the barrel peasants, but merchants, soldiers, an awful lot of small farmers, the free peasants, they all could read and write. Now, the Byzantine Church, remember we talked about that concept of Caesaropapism. Caesaropapism put the emperor above the power of the Pope. Right? Caesar over Pope. Basically, there was no separation between church and state. The emperor was the head of the church and would often involve himself with it, but he didn't generally run the day-to-day operations of the church. He left that. All right, here's a picture of Constantine, kind of overall of the clergy. But he left the running of it generally to the patriarchs. The patriarchs handled the church administration. Here you have Alexander, one of the early patriarchs of Constantinople, and here you have the current patriarch of Constantinople, Bartholomew. You notice some of the physical differences in dress and beard and so forth. I'll show some of that stuff again in a little bit. And they didn't always meet eye to eye. It wasn't that they were always on the same page. Sometimes the patriarchs chafed under the imperial orders that they would be given. Ultimately, the emperor did have, authority here, but that didn't mean that it didn't sometimes result in some conflict. An example of the conflict between emperor and church was over iconoclasm. Iconoclasm, yeah. Literally, it translates to the breaking of icons. Here you have an early mosaic of, guys smashing pictures of Jesus. This Emperor Leo III implemented this policy. He was convinced that the worshiping of statues and paintings and pictures of Jesus and Mary and these holy figures was sinful. And so he said, that's it, we're destroying all of them. And it didn't last all that long, but it actually would have very long-lasting impact on relations between the East and the Western churches, which we'll talk more about in a second. The Byzantine Church was also very heavily influenced by classical Greek work. It led, like I said, the work of Socrates and Plato and so forth. It led them to debate the nature of Jesus, to debate the nature of the Trinity and so forth. And another big aspect of the Byzantine Church was monasticism. Okay, living in the monasteries, living as a monk, the laity, the lay people, they felt much more of a connection with monks than with these patriarchs and emperors who were fighting amongst themselves or debating large dogmatic issues such as the nature of Jesus. In order to really just get to the basics of Jesus' message, they felt much more of a connection to these people who were living simple lives. Now, the Byzantine monastic orders were very heavily influenced by Eastern asceticism, right? The doing away of worldly pleasures. This was influenced by Zoroastrianism, and even Buddhism as well from the contact on the Silk Road. But they didn't really have much direction until this guy, St. Basil. He was the one who set down the rules for monastic life. He said, this is how we're going to live in orders and so forth. And he became a very important figure in the early Byzantine church. The last part here, talk about East-West church relations. Now, you look at, originally you had your 5 patriarchs, right? Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. In the 8th century, when the Arabs would eventually conquer all of this area, these three would essentially be taken off the table because they would all become Muslim-controlled territories. That left essentially only Rome and Constantinople as the major centers of Christianity, and basically setting them up as a rivalry because Constantinople said that we're New Rome, Rome said we're Old Rome, the Bishop of Rome took the title of Pope, and it's just not going to work out all that well. So let's get rid of these. Okay, so you had an awful lot of divisions, right? Iconoclasm, as I said, this divided the Christian community. Some were minor, such as the shaving of beards. Here you have the current patriarch, as I showed you before, and Pope Francis, right? You're never going to see Pope Francis with a big frilly beard like that. But those are relatively minor. Or the use of unleavened bread in the Eucharist and so forth. Some were big, like the nature of the Trinity and the whole relationship between God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit and so forth. And this eventually resulted in a power struggle. The Pope was going to claim authority over all Christianity, and the patriarchs weren't going to listen to him. This eventually results in the East-West Schism, sometimes referred to as the Great Schism in 1054. And these guys, there's going to be a nasty breakup here. And while they're obviously on somewhat friendly terms today, they're never going to get back together. And you're going to have this. You're going to have a Western church, often referred to as a Roman Catholic church, and the Eastern Orthodox church, which is largely Greek-speaking. And this becomes a permanent split in Christianity. They're not necessarily fighting and killing each other, but they do not worship the same. Differences in Easter, differences in practices, and certainly differences in power hierarchy. Okay, so quick overview of a couple of aspects of that, and then we will have our last video on the Byzantine Empire, which we will go over tomorrow.